Welcome to the last installment of the Economic Liberty Lecture Series for the spring here in 2012. I'll make my intro brief here and turn it over to Carly here from the Economic Society here for GMU. The Future Freedom Foundation is a nonprofit libertarian educational foundation whose mission is to spread an uncompromising vision of libertarianism through a variety of methods, through talks like this, through other lectures, through the written word, of course, through the internet. For those of you online tonight who are not familiar with us, go to fff.org, check out our website. Also, sign up for our free internet newsletter, FFF email update. It's free for the asking. Just subscribe to fff@fff.org. And at this time in the intro is when I normally give a little spiel for the Econ Society, but instead this time I would like to thank Carly Rettig for all the work that she's done. She's getting ready to leave here. She is responsible for putting all this together, and this is her last event. So big applause for Carly. Thank you. And with that, Carly Rettig.
Good evening. As Bart said, my name is Carly Rettig, and I am the outgoing president of the GMU Econ Society. The Econ Society is a student group dedicated to spreading the economic way of thinking through lecture series, discussion groups, and other interactions between students and professional economists. If you'd like to learn more about the Econ Society, please talk to me after the lecture, or Rachel, the next year's president. Raise your hand. Or my brother Cole, the current and vice president next year as well. If you are in Dave Hebert's class, come talk to me after the lecture as well so you can get extra credit. I am pleased to introduce Benjamin Powell. Dr. Powell is an associate professor of economics at Suffolk University. He received his Ph.D. here at George Mason in 2003. His areas of interest include Austrian economics, economic development, and public choice. He has written many articles and 3 books: Modern Principles, Microeconomics, Housing America, and Making Poor Nations Rich. The current topic he is speaking on, he will have a book coming out next year on that topic. The working title is No Sweat, How Sweatshops Improve Lives and Economic Growth. Please welcome Dr. Benjamin Powell.
Well, thank you, Carly. It's a pleasure to be here at GMU. As she mentioned, I'm a graduate, and it's always great to come back. It's also great to be able to do this in conjunction with Future Freedom Foundation, who I think very highly of. And it's great to be back here at Mason and see even former students. Zach is a student of mine from when I was teaching here when I was a grad student. So really happy to be with you and talking about this topic with you, one that I lecture on widely on college campuses, just generally not to as friendly an audience as what I'll get at George Mason for free market economics when it comes to sweatshops. Often I'll walk in the room and like the women's studies class is already in there and has like daggers in their eyes for me. So it's kind of nice to be here to do it. So to put a human face on it before I get into showing you some of the numbers and economic arguments. This is a look inside a sweatshop. It's a place where not many of us would like to work. You can see that conditions are presumably hot in there, hence the word sweat as well. Their shirts are off. It's kind of crowded. This particular one, you can see a fan in the back, but the fan blade isn't moving either, so whether it works or not, I'm not sure. There is a fire extinguisher, and the workers are smiling, but presumably because someone's to say cheese for the camera. This is not a place where many of us would aspire to work. But that's not the relevant question for most people who work in sweatshops. It's how does it compare to the alternatives that are available to them, not the alternatives we face here. And in these cases, it's often much worse. So working out in the fields and subsistence agriculture, this, if you've been to a poorer country, is quite common to see people who go often actually, it's just after Earth Day, so we can have our Earth Day moment here at GMU too. We'll go on to the common land and harvest from the commons trees without replanting and then go in and sell it for fuel in the village. Or even worse, being destitute, begging, scavenging. These are much worse alternatives to sweatshops. So if we're going to advocate things for sweatshop workers, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we don't jeopardize the jobs that they have and throw them into these even worse alternatives. Instead, it's got to be about how do we expand the set of choices that they have so that they have better jobs available to them. So let's start by defining a sweatshop. So sweatshop's kind of a loaded word. Maybe you guys can help me with it. What makes something a sweatshop? Sweat. Okay, thank you. We've identified the word. What else? There's even 2 bullet points to get you to the next 2. Low wages, at least relative to what we have in the United States, and poor working conditions. What do we mean by poor working conditions? What are the things that would make something a sweatshop? Dangerous, long hours. So dangerous, it could be at risk of like you getting your fingers caught in the machines and cut off, or it could be like long-term health risks. There's fibers in the air, you're inhaling them. So it could be unhealthy or dangerous, long working hours. Okay, low lighting maybe. Risk of danger at work from fires, sure. No air conditioning or just unpleasant working conditions. That could be the cramp part of it. Long working hours, again, very long. Thanks, Pete. It may be unpredictability of the working hours, too. So it's like you go to the factory that day, you think you're going to get done in 10 hours, but then they're like, nope, got to meet deadlines. You're staying here for 14. Sorry. So unpredictability in it. These are the general characteristics of sweatshops, places where they have all of these unpleasant working conditions. But despite that, workers choose to work there. That's the type of sweatshops I'm talking about today. There are other cases, although few and far between, where it's literally what I'd call slave labor, where workers work there because either the government, in conjunction with the company, or the company themselves, uses the threat of violence to get the workers to work there. That's slave labor. I think that should be opposed. It's obviously not better than the alternatives. You don't have to use violence to get somebody to do something if it's their best option available to them. So in the face of that type of sweatshop labor, the appropriate response is either trade sanctions, boycotts, or the type of things that people advocate for other style sweatshops usually. We want to dry up the demand for those goods. But in these other cases where workers voluntarily choose to work there, that's the type that I'm talking about, because that choice indicates a couple things. I think, one, morally it's important that we should respect their autonomy if that's what they're choosing for themselves. But also, as economists looking at it, if that's what they're choosing, that's telling us in their mind they view that as their least bad option that they face. So we shouldn't do things that take away their least bad option. What we should do is give them more options that they might choose that are better than that. But we have to leave them the freedom to choose so that we know we're actually improving their conditions rather than taking them away. The kind of anti-sweatshop movement in the United States got going back in the mid-1990s, really. And initially, most economists kind of leapt to the defense of sweatshops. In fact, from like a wide variety of the political spectrum. So like Walter Williams, the department chair at the time when I was a grad student here, he'd written an op-ed back then defending low-wage sweatshop jobs, which we might predict to come out of Walter Williams. But Paul Krugman wrote one, too. Hardly like that bastion of free market economic thought. In fact, it actually really pains me. For the book that I have coming out on this, the lead quote is from Paul Krugman. And somehow it just feels dirty to do it. But at the same time, to reach out to crazy lefty audiences who might not want to hear my arguments about sweatshops. Otherwise, when Paul Krugman writes an article for Slate called Bad Jobs at Bad Wages are Better Than No Jobs at All, it gives you a little bit of credibility of like, listen, if even Paul Krugman believes this, maybe there's something to the position. So economists initially seemed to jump to the defense of sweatshops. And it was because they'd make these type of comparisons. In Cambodia, where hundreds of people scavenge for plastic bags, metal cans, bits of food, and a trash dump, they talk about one worker who averages 75 cents a day for her efforts. It says for her, the idea of being exploited in a garment factory, working only 6 days a week, inside instead of 7 days in the broiling sun for up to $2 a day is a dream. Now, of course, we want that dream to improve, but we don't want to jeopardize the $2 job to go down to the 75-cent one. That was the comparison that jumped out in my head the first time I saw this article. But then there's actually something else in here, too, something I didn't initially attach a great deal of weight to, and that's inside instead of outside. The first time that this impression was made on me, I was traveling. I subsidize my hiking with my economics, so I often get to go nice places to go hiking while I'm doing economics. And I was down in Guatemala. I've been down there a number of times. And I was out hiking a couple of volcanoes there, Catenango and Fuego. And while we're coming down from it, we had hired a local hiking guide. Not because the mountain was particularly tough, but because the price of labor was particularly low, and they included transportation, food, and a tent, so I didn't have to pack all that stuff on the plane. And as we're coming down, I'm talking to the guide, and there's a man out working on the lower slopes of the volcano where they were clearing away the wood in order to go sell it back at the village. And the man was essentially performing the function of an ox. He had a cross piece on his shoulder. He had 2 big logs like that big around propped up on either end where he was pulling it down the mountain. And I asked the guide, I said, well, how much do you think he makes per day doing this? And I forget the exact amount in quetzales, but roughly translated into about a beer per day. This is how I do foreign currency when I'm in other countries, just figure out how much a beer costs and just evaluate everything in like how many beers is that. As a result, I don't bring home many souvenirs. In any event, in this case, it was about a beer per day that he was making. I said, well, what about somebody, I didn't say sweatshop, I said, who works in a garment factory, like entry-level garment factory job, not in Guatemala City, but, on the outskirts or whatever. Oh, well, it varies. He didn't really want to give me an answer. He keeps going back and forth. Finally, I nail him down, and he says, well, maybe the equivalent of about 2 to 3 beers per day. And before I could say anything, he didn't know that I was an economist and was like into this stuff. He said, but there's a difference. That's inside, not outside in the fields like him. Like there was a difference in status and career path once you've moved into the factory. And this is coming from a guy who's a hiking guide, so it's not like he hates the outdoors. It was on that trip as we were coming down the mountain. That's a picture from the bottom of it of a couple people carting away some of the chopped wood. But another trip actually to the same place. This was taken when we were coming off the same mountain on a Thursday midday. And you can see it's children who are out there working in the field. Often people, when they oppose child labor, are opposing child labor in the factories implicitly in their mind is if they lose their job in that factory, they'll go to school and grow up and build more human capital. But the fact of the matter is most children employed around the world do not work in manufacturing. Most work in agriculture. The second leading area would be in household services. Manufacturing is a very small amount of the child labor. When they lose their factory job, they don't go to school. They end up like these kids. It's hard to tell from the picture, but probably 9 to 11 years old or so. They end up working out in the fields there and essentially training and building the human capital to become like the man who is working as an ox. So while I'm going to be talking about sweatshops generally, I think all of these arguments equally apply to children workers as well. So sometimes for children, the examples can be even worse. In 1994, Congressman Tom Harkin proposed a bill that would ban imports from Bangladesh because they were using child labor there. In response, firms fired their child employees, and according to Oxfam, thousands of them became prostitutes or starved. Child prostitution or starvation is clearly worse than sewing in a factory. So these are the outcomes that we have to avoid. And if we're going to do that, then we have to understand the economics of what determines the level of compensation and the mix of compensation of these employees. So level of compensation. Actually, you guys can do it for me. You in the green shirt. What's your name? Eric. Eric, would you like to be? You are going to be my sweatshop factory owner. All right. And your name? Jennifer. Jennifer's a potential sweatshop factory employee. Jennifer can stitch really well. And she could probably stitch enough shoes to make you about $2 per day. What's the maximum you're willing to pay Jennifer? $1. Okay, what's your name? Eric, the maximum Eric's willing to pay is $1. So he's going to try to offer you $1 to work there. Cape Cod, I'm from Massachusetts. What's your name? Ricky, you're also a sweatshop factory owner. Jennifer can also produce $2 a day of value at your factory. What is the maximum you would be willing to pay her? $1.99. Thank you, we did this quicker. $1.99. Basically, the upper bound, the maximum you'd ever be willing to pay her is how much does she contribute to your revenue, right? So that's going to be our upper bound. That's the maximum that you're going to give Jennifer is how much does she contribute to your revenue. Now, of course, would you like to pay her that? No. In fact, you'd like to pay her 1, but you don't even want to pay her 1. You want to pay her 0, right? Just come here, work, and I make profit. Cool. Jennifer, if they gave you that offer of come here, work, I make profit, you make nothing, would you go?
It would depend on what my alternatives are.
Yes, it would depend on what your alternatives are, or in econ speak, our opportunity cost, right? So in this case, in order to get the job at his factory, he just has to offer you better than the $1 that you were going to get here. So we're establishing what are the bounds of wages then. Upper bound is worker productivity. Lower bound is what's their next best alternative. If we're going to do things that improve the lives of sweatshop workers, it has to be about improving those bounds. Either things that make them more productive or gives them more opportunities to bid their wages closer to the upper bound. In practice, about 75–80% of the variation in wages across country is explained by productivity differences. So the big game is about playing upper bound. But in some cases, to some extent, from moving lower bound as well. But basically, we've got to find ways to make these workers more productive. And I've made this point before. I've done this sweatshop talk many places, and I've done it a few times in a debate format, which I love. I have so much more fun like that. And a woman I was debating, I was actually kind of surprised. She gave up on this point right away when I went in. About that's how the wages are determined. And as a result, we can't mandate higher wages. She's like, but it's really all of those other characteristics of sweatshops that are the problems. The long hours, the dangerous working conditions, the risk of sexual harassment on the job, all of these other things. That's what we have to legislate and try to change. Which actually the student group who sponsored her to come in was actually kind of like aghast that she wasn't in favor of a minimum wage for them. But then the question becomes, well, what determines, I feel like I'm like tethered to my sewing machine here. If we can untape this. So, oh, I'm tethered all over the place. I'm not going to get far. What determines their mix of compensation then? So it's not just the wages, but how is the compensation divided between other things? I forget, Cape Cod, was it Derek? Rick. All right, what? Rick. If you're going to pay her $1.99 an hour, do you care if you give her $1.99 an hour in cash or $1.50 cash and 49 cents in vacation time, safer working conditions, other things? No. I mean, maybe a little bit to some extent, like that her not cutting her fingers off makes her more productive. But assuming there's a suitable replacement for her hanging around, that really doesn't probably weigh much for you anyway. But basically, after we adjust for things that would increase your productivity, you don't care. It's just a cost is a cost is a cost. It comes off your bottom line. Do you care? You do care. The employees care about their mix of preferences. The employer is largely different of how they care about the total level. They want that as small as possible. But once that's determined, how they divide the mix really isn't driven by their preferences. They have every incentive to give the mix of benefits that the employee would want, right? Because if they do a mix of compensation that cost him $1.99, but because it's not her preferred mix, she only values it at $1.80, he's leaving money on the table here, right? If he can get her for $1.80 but mix the compensation to the way she likes, he's going to make more profits. So first world activists like to pose it like, oh, these evil multinational corporations are determining these bad working conditions for the people. Well, they don't really care about the working conditions one way or another. What they care about is total compensation. Given overall level of productivity and total compensation, they're largely indifferent of how they allocate it. But because workers care about it, they have every incentive to make it look like what the average worker wants. Now, of course, they can't tailor it to each individual employee, making sure that, but on average, they make the mix kind of reflect what the employee wants, right? We call this compensating differentials in economics. In fact, actually, Jacob and I were talking about it when I was coming here, and I said that, it was great to be down at GMU, and, he was paying me to come down and give a lecture. I said, yeah, but I had to hang around with Pete and Chris all afternoon, and I should have got a bigger paycheck to have to deal with them because it's compensating differentials. Well, same thing is true in sweatshops as when the working conditions are worse, it would take a higher wage, all else equal, to attract the employees. So this actually is a question that I investigated again on a totally different trip down to Guatemala. A couple firms there. So like economic theory tells us that this is what happens, but somehow when you talk to people in women's studies or wherever else, they don't believe in economic theory. And they want to say, well, what's some empirical evidence of this anywhere? I said, well, okay. I identified 2 sweatshops in Guatemala. And it is kind of a blurry line of like, what's a sweatshop versus what's low-wage industrialization? So we had characteristics of sweatshops before, but like how low does the wage have to be? How bad do the working conditions have to be before it becomes, quote, sweatshop? So the way I identified these was I was like, all right, well, what did protesters call sweatshops in Guatemala? The National Labor Committee is a group that goes around calling people sweatshops and doing exposés on them. And they had identified 4 firms in Guatemala that they called harmful sweatshops. 2 of them, well, one of them was in agriculture, food processing, which really doesn't fit the model of most sweatshops, so we weren't interested in that one. Of the 3 Apparel ones, 1 had gone out of business, 2, Sam Bridge and Nicotex, were still in business. So we went down and surveyed the workers. This is Sam Bridge's factory. So I had hired a local firm who interviewed employees when they were leaving the factory, so it was not on factory time, so they couldn't say that the employers were allowing us to only, talk to the most docile or easygoing employees. And we asked them a series of questions about their wages and their working conditions. And that's me inside the sweatshop, which the sweat is actually from the car ride there. It was ventilated when I was in there. This was after I did a follow-up about 9 months later where I visited the factory and got to meet with the owner. And he was very confused by this whole process, that there was a U.S. economist who was coming down who actually liked his factory. I think he kept thinking I was going to go into a telephone booth and jump out and be like, National Labor Committee. It's never. He was showing me a trophy his employees gave him. He's like, oh, they really like me. I'm like, first of all, I don't believe your trophy. They're really poor. They don't have money for trophies. Secondly, you had me at hello. Because I already surveyed your workers, and this is what I found out. So people will ask sweatshop employees, would you like better working? Of course, I could ask Pete and Chris, would you like George Mason to pay you more? Yes. Would you like bigger, nicer office? Yes, I would. And that's what people do with sweatshop employees all the time, is they pick out people who say, I wish I had better working. Of course they do. I wish I had. The question is, what would you give up for them? So we asked them a series of different questions. Are you willing to work for lower pay if your employer so this list isn't random. This is the list of things that the National Labor Committee was complaining about. Reduced the number of hours you had to work, made your hours more predictable, gave you more bathroom breaks, gave you longer lunch breaks, made your working conditions more pleasant, made them safer, provided health insurance, gave you paid vacation, which is one thing Guatemala law mandates that one of the firms was not doing. Ditto with the health insurance. Treated you more fairly, reduced your risk of sexual harassment. If I wasn't tethered to my podium over here, I would walk by the yes, no, and you can see overwhelmingly, no, 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 no. We're not willing to give up any of our pay for better working conditions. Vacation's what gets the most approval, and there 81% of the people still say, no, we wouldn't want that if we had to give up pay for it. And this should not be shocking. All of these things are what most economists would call normal goods. These people are desperately poor, trying to feed and clothe their family. As a result, they want every bit of their compensation in money so that they can do that. As they grow wealthier, then these things will tend to improve later. In fact, actually, Pete has a nice article that he did with somebody else one time on how it is improvements in income, really, that are a better predictor of the working conditions than the laws. So the laws that they advocate for these third world countries to look like the United States didn't adopt until they had 10,000 per capita in income, 8,000 per capita in income. These countries are all much poorer, where the workers aren't going to want these things. It should come as no surprise. It's exactly what economic theory would tell us. So then the last thing that people will bring up in this and kind of the basic economics is what they'll say, but these companies make exorbitant profits. Can't they just pay them a little bit more and make a little less in profit? Few different points here. One, it's actually usually not the multinationals who employ the workers. It's domestic subcontractors. But even still, if we're talking about the multinational it's not like if there were huge returns and they really were making exorbitant profits, we should see the values of these companies like explode and like everybody wants to enter the apparel industry. Not really observing that. But even if it were true, let's say they are making millions of dollars, because what they do is they do this little like weird calculation where they're like, the cost of stitching this shoe is $2, its final market price is $120, plow, there's this much in profit. No, there's actually like marketing and everything else that goes into that too. Be that as it may, if that were true, it doesn't mean that you can just legislate profits to the employees. These firms aren't charities. These firms are trying to make money, and they will maximize profit. If you change the rules of the game and mandate that they have to have either better working conditions or higher pay, that makes the relative cost of third world labor higher with respect to capital and first world already productive labor. As a result, they're going to use less of it, unemploy some workers, throw them into worse alternatives. So just identifying a pool of profits doesn't change the fact that the business is a profit maximizer, and on the margin, they're going to adjust. If you make their labor more expensive, they'll use less of it. So you still don't avoid these things just by saying, hey, look, they have a bunch of profits. The Anti-Sweatshop Movement is a curious mix. Actually, I forgot to check. Does GMU have a Students Against Sweatshop chapter here? Not anymore. That's what we like to hear. Okay. Well, every camp, I mean, you've got 25,000 people at George Mason now. I'm sure you've got some. It's a curious mix. So major players in it, though, Unite and National Labor Committee. Unite is a garment workers union in the United States. United Students Against Sweatshops started at Duke in the late 1990s and spread to campuses around the country after that. Different things that they call for. And by the way, it's no accident that Unite is involved in this, because they understand. What's the job of a union? What's a union supposed to do? Can you help me? You can help me?
Reduce the supply of labor to increase wages.
It's at a minimum, it's supposed to increase its members' wages. And often it does this through the supply side restrictions of not letting other people in. So why are they running around, though, and saying we're going to help third world workers? Third world workers, how many of them are members of Unite?
0.
Whoop, that's probably not 0, but it's close enough approximation. So they'd have you believe they just do this out of worker solidarity, that, you know, we're for workers, workers of the world unite type stuff. Well, no. They understand that first world labor and third world labor are substitutes for each other. If they can make third world labor more expensive, people in the third world will lose their job, but Unite will have more demand for its first world laborers here in the United States. So I think the movement, you know, it's got the Bono-style celebrity type things that are involved in it. But then labor unions, who it's in their economic interest, and student groups who they just really haven't had systematic thinking in economics, and they rightfully feel for third world workers, but unfortunately don't think and figure out that they're not actually helping them. Things that they'll call for, so we've already kind of implicitly talked about how labor standards make them worse off. Minimum or living wages, which risk raising the compensation level above the upper bound and thus unemploying workers. I put right to organize in quotation marks because they don't mean the right of like Pete, Chris, and I to get together and say we're going to bargain as a unit with, George Mason, Future Freedom Foundation, or whoever. Instead, what they mean is if Pete and I vote and say, hey, you, me, and Chris all have to be together and bargain as a unit, and Chris is like, no, I don't like you guys, I can do better on my own, they mean, no, Chris still has to bargain with us. So it's kind of forced association. That's why I don't like calling it just freedom of association or a right to organize. One of the worst things, and the student groups have got better at this over time, although they still do it, is boycott. In this case, the Gap, Old Navy store, somehow they threw in Save the Redwoods with it, too. It must be like a UC Santa Cruz thing. Another instance, boycott Nike. So boycott, what are you instantly doing for the demand for these goods and services? Decreasing it. If that's going to be a sustainable long-run thing, then demand for those workers is decreased. You need fewer of them. And for that matter, if you just want to sell your products, if you've lost demand for your product and you need to sell, what do you have to do? Lower price, right? It's Jennifer, right? Jennifer can still stitch just as fast as she could before. But now, since fewer people want to buy the product, it's worth less. As a result, the amount she contributes to the profits is no longer $1.99. It's dropped down to maybe $1.50. Her upper bound just shrank, even though nothing physical changed about her. So boycotts destroy value that these workers are creating. Embarrassed to say there have been some economists who are involved in the anti-sweatshop movement. Kind of the usual suspects who led it. UMass, Powell and his crew there pushed a circular letter that went around. Notre Dame, New School, Harvard. And their letter actually wasn't bad. I mean, I disagreed with it, but they made a valid point in it. Basically, what had happened was the International Trade Economist, a group that was led by Bourguardi, circulated a letter to colleges and universities around the country saying, don't ban sweatshop products from your college bookstores. It will be bad for the workers who work there. And one thing they did is they cited evidence that multinational firms tend to pay more than domestic firms in third world countries. What this group pointed out in their response letter was, well, that doesn't really speak to the situation in which most garments are made, which is by domestic subcontractors, not the multinationals. So they're right on that point. The implication from their thing, though, is therefore we can ban sweatshop products, which I think is wrong. But this is what actually got me interested in working on sweatshop research. In fact, actually with a student of mine at the time, David Scarbeck's his name, who taught when I was at San Jose State, who recently just earned a Ph.D. here at George Mason. He and I did my first sweatshops article together, where we said, well, let's try to find out systematic evidence of how sweatshops jobs compare to the other alternatives in these countries, because there have been economists who wrote op-eds like comparing the trash dump to it or prostitution to it, but there was kind of no like systematic evidence of it. So what we did is we scoured U.S. news sources from the mid-1990s up to I think 2003 or so is when we started working on the article, and I've since updated it to 2010 for the book, or more accurately my TA did. Because it involves a lot of searching through LexisNexis and all of the U.S. news sources for instances of something being protested as a sweatshop. Once we got our list of protested sweatshops, we then looked at two different things. We looked at the actual protested sweatshops themselves and what wages were being paid, and also the apparel industry generally in those countries, since the apparel industry is the leading user of sweatshop labor. This here are the wages for the apparel industry in the countries where we could both get that wage data and had cases of sweatshops. It ranges from a low of 13 cents in Bangladesh to a high, I think, in Costa Rica of $2.38, which seems very low by U.S. standards, but this compares it to the rest of the jobs available in that economy. This is showing it as a percent of GDP, whether you work 40, 50, 60, or 70 hours a week. In general, the 60 and 70-hour-a-week estimates are the ones that are most accurate, since, after all, one of the characteristics of a sweatshop is long working hours. This is the 100% line. Anytime the line's above the 100%, that means working in the apparel industry in these countries lifts your income higher than the average income in the country. Most cases, it's above twice. In some, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, we're talking 5, 6, 7 times average national income. In comparison, just think in the United States, average is right around $40,000 per capita. In some cases, this would be like taking a $280,000 per year job in the United States and saying, that's a bad job in that economy. Just doesn't make any sense. It's vastly better than most of the alternatives faced by these workers. We can also compare it to abject poverty living conditions. Many people live on less than $1 or $2 a day in these countries. but working in a sweatshop or working in an apparel industry in these countries, in most of the examples lifts you above the $2 a day threshold. The only exception is Bangladesh. There it brings you above the $1 a day threshold, but a third of the population fails to get that, and fewer than 20% of them actually get over the $2 a day hurdle. Next step is, let's compare it to the actual protested sweatshops, the worst of the worst, the ones that are making the news. So this is probably why other economists hadn't done this empirical comparison before, is because there's no nice, neat database of sweatshop wages that you can download from the World Bank or whoever else. So it was a bit cumbersome to assemble it, and what we're getting then is wage data often from newspaper reporters who are taking it at face value, the words of anti-sweatshop activists that they're quoting in their news stories. So two things that happen with this. One, there's just a lot of extra noise in the data because we don't know what exchange rate they used or things like that. But that shouldn't systematically bias the results. It should be just noise. But then the next part is, since it's the protesters who are giving us the wage data indirectly through the news source, if anybody has an incentive to understate the sweatshop wages, it would be them, because they're trying to say how bad the job is. So to some extent, that might bias our wage data down, which makes it harder for me to show what I want to show you, which is that they're still better than the alternatives. This is the face of sweatshop employers. So often we found in the articles people who were directly or indirectly employing the sweatshop workers, Mary Kate and Ashley, Walmart, and I thought that was P. Diddy, but someone told me that it wasn't. Actually, Chris the rap star here, he knows rappers better than me. Who is it? It's Fiddy. So Fiddy actually Fiddy, you even said it right, huh? You came here for well, Fiddy pays his workers more than 50 cents, so he shouldn't be up there. It should have been P. Diddy. This is probably a little bit small for some of you in the room, but this is the list that we put together then. A number of them in Bangladesh. There's the Mary Kate and Ashley one. A lot of the ones that we found are NBA, MLB, things that you're getting the logo on for the apparel. A couple in Brazil, a few in Burma, Cambodia, a bunch in China, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador. There's P. Diddy. He's in Honduras. Haiti, Honduras. Oh, the other one in Honduras, Walmart and Kathy Lee. This is a famous episode. In the late 1990s, Charles Kiernan, the president of the National Labor Committee, brought a Honduran girl, Wendy Diaz was her name, to the United States and brought her on to Kathy Lee Gifford's TV show and confronted her on the air and said, "You are paying this poor Honduran worker 31 cents an hour. You should be ashamed of yourself." And Kathy Lee burst into tears on the air and said, "I'm sorry, I'll make things better," or whatever. So there's a chapter in my book called "Don't Cry for Me, Kathy Lee." Because at 31 cents an hour, that lifts her way above the standard of living of most people in her country. What we should be crying for is her cousin or her aunt or somebody who doesn't work for Kathy Lee and actually faces really bad alternatives. A bunch in India more recently, Indonesia, where a lot of them are Nike, Laos, Mauritius is kind of an odd one I'll come back to, Nicaragua, South Africa, Thailand, Vietnam. So same comparison as what we did before when we did the apparel industry generally. We're going to compare sweatshop wages to GDP per capita in these countries. So we construct an average sweatshop wage and an average GDP per capita, weighting it by the appropriate number of years. So we're doing apples to apples here. Here's what we find. Less dramatic than the overall apparel industry one. So here is my 100% line. In a few cases, we get significantly over that. So Cambodia, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, Vietnam, we're all above or sometimes well above average in the economy. Keep in mind, these are the very firms that are being singled out for protest and still finding them better than average. A lot of them just get it. So, by the way, just because it's below 100% doesn't equate into oh, that's a bad job. I mean, by definition, half of all of your jobs are going to be worse than average in any economy. It's that they're the best available job for that worker. But even still, a lot of them look like pretty average jobs in these economies. Bangladesh, we're about 70, so in the range of 60 to 90% of national income. Bangladesh, Costa Rica, Costa Rica's a little bit of, but El Salvador, Dominican Republic, we're getting into that range. India, a little bit higher, ditto for Indonesia. Laos, a little bit lower. Then there's a few exceptions here. So the exceptions are interesting. So I went back and investigated each one of these individually and looking through the article. And what you find in Brazil, it's not Brazilians who are working there. It's illegal immigrants from Bolivia. So they crossed the border to get there and work, and if we compared their wages in Brazil to average Bolivian income, then it looks much greater than 100%, and which clearly that's the relative opportunity cost for those workers. And the same thing is true when you look at Mauritius. Mauritius is a fairly wealthy African island nation. But where are the people coming from who are working in the sweatshops? India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Again, compare it to average incomes in those countries, and again, you're up above the 100% line. Ditto for Laos and Thailand, and actually to some extent Vietnam, because they're dealing with immigrants coming out of Burma or Myanmar, which notice I had sweatshop examples of, but doesn't make this. It's because you can't get decent GDP per capita data out of that country, which gives you an idea of what the alternative looks like. It's a hell. South Africa is the one exception where there wasn't immigration as the explanation for it being down. And there it was a case where there was an urban minimum wage being applied to the rural area. The cops actually showed up to try to enforce it. The workers at the factory rioted and attacked the cops because they understood they were going to lose their jobs. So I wouldn't say that's really a case against my findings. Again, we can compare it to people living on less than $1 and $2 a day adjusted for purchasing power. That's just the same thing I showed you before. Significant chunks of these countries live on less of it. Working in a sweatshop, convert the average sweatshop wage to purchasing power in these countries. It gets you above $2 a day in all of them. In some, and this is actually particularly relevant for if we go back, if you look at like Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, where there's very few people who are lower than $1 and $2 a day. But then look at what their actual sweatshop wages or earnings are there. We're talking $10, $12, $18 per day purchasing power adjusted, so considerably higher. So U.S. cartoonists can make jokes like the small brain boss who's like, look on the bright side, no one will mug you for your paycheck, to the sweatshop worker. But they've got it exactly wrong. Unless you're a tourist, the next best person to get mugged in those countries would be the sweatshop worker because they are earning more than most of the other people in their economy. Now, this doesn't translate into, therefore, we can't do nothing. I think we should try to do things to improve the lives of these workers. But we have to be very careful about what we can do, because most of it, I think, actually throws them into the worst alternatives. One thing that there might be some room for that activists do is on the margin what I'd call air sweatshops. So some version of so-called ethical branding. So Michael Jordan gets paid millions of dollars by Nike. To my knowledge, Michael's never stitched a shoe in his life. Why does Nike pay him so much? Because his name makes other people buy stuff, because you all want to be like Mike, right? That's what it comes down to. It creates subjective value in your brain. As a result, they pay him for his contribution to the product's value. If, instead of all wanting to be like Mike, you're all like, if these shoes were produced in a third world country, I'm going to value the shoe more because I know I'm helping this worker's life. And in fact, the company can make it part of its advertising. If we pay double the prevailing market wage in this country, as a result, our workers are better off than the other people there. If that creates value in consumers' mind, well, then that's a shift out of the demand curve. So it's not just raising the cost of labor and then raising the cost of the product and getting a decrease in quantity demand. It's done something to shift it out. I think there's a positive role for that. So it's kind of actually like the opposite of a buy in the USA made in, it's like hate made in the USA. Love sweatshops abroad. It doesn't have like the catch with most people's ingrown biases, but would be something that would effectively raise their upper bound with nothing physically changing about them. However, I think while there's some room for that, it can't be at a policy level. It has to be an individual company marketing strategy level, because it's not true that consumers will shift out their demand for lots of these products. In fact, I'm fairly skeptical that there's a great demand for it from most consumers. So it could be part of a niche product. But I actually think it's worse than that. So like while there's potential there, I also think it's just writ large with fraud of people who want to feel good about themselves without actually doing good. So they want to feel like they're helping the sweatshop worker by buying the product, but whether his conditions actually are any better or not is of secondary importance. So a lot of this goes on with like Fairtrade Coffee. So there's a group called Sweat-Free Communities, and you can shop in their catalog and buy all products that are guaranteed to come from a factory where the workers have the right to organize, are paid a living wage, and I don't know, everything else is milk and honey. That's a map of where those factories are located. You're not helping third world sweatshop buyers by buying from sweat-free communities. In fact, actually, the map's not quite right. There is one way over, I think it was in Thailand, but I didn't want to expand the map for one data point over there. It's basically US and Canadian factories. It's really easy to get approved to sell sweatshop free if you already have to hire expensive first world labor who already gets good conditions. But people go and buy the product thinking that they're helping third world workers. Really, they're just making wealthy first world workers better off. Which, if that's your intent, fine, but let's be honest about it. these are a stage in the process of economic development. They're not new. They were there in Britain. They were there in the United States. In Britain and the United States, it's about a 120, 150-year process, depending how you date it, of going through that stage. What does it take? It takes better technology, more physical capital that embodies that technology, and human capital improvements. As those things improve, your upper bound improves, your productivity does, and your wages follow. But it's a process that takes time. It's not like a instant pill that you can give this country to jump through that stage of development. So it's a necessary part of the development problem, but it's not a sufficient one. Though I should say, it can happen much faster now than what it used to. It doesn't have to be a 120-year process like it was in the United States. Think of what were sweatshop countries in 1960? Who were the sweatshop using countries? Taiwan, to some extent Japan, Hong Kong, when made in Hong Kong was like a joke, South Korea. What are these countries now? They're wealthy first world countries. Why? Because compared to Great Britain, when the technology had to be created anew, the technology is already out there. What they need is the capital goods that will embody it. And that capital is also out there. Like the United States process went faster than Great Britain's, one, because we stole some of Britain's technology, and two, the capital investment that came from Britain helped the United States grow. But the world is so much wealthier today than when either of us went through that process, that now, generation and a half, those East Asian countries go from sweatshop living standards to first world status. Look at some of the growth that's going on in poorer countries today. When they get their institutions right, the growth can be explosive because they're so much farther behind. So while it's a process and a stage that you have to go through, it can be quicker than it used to, but you still got to go through it. The real game is getting institutions right, actually, so that you can grow. That's a harder process. So I think for countries that are in the sweatshop stage of development that have lousy institutions, sweatshops are a lifeline that are making workers a little bit better off than what they could otherwise be. For countries that get their institutions right, then the growth that comes, you grow your way out of sweatshops, conditions improve, and things get better. These other things, leisure, comfort, safety, child leisure, these are all likely normal goods, which means as your incomes go up, they take care of themselves. So we just got to get the process of growth going. I should say, for another thing that you can do if you're an activist who just cares about like the welfare of third world workers, while giving them institutions in their home country is hard, we have decent institutions here. A Haitian who moves out of Haiti and into the United States instantly experiences economic development. Some people might say like, oh, but Haiti's not developing, but who cares? Like, Haiti's a place. We care about the humanity. Like, Antarctica has low GDP. Does anybody like walk around going like, oh no, Antarctica's got low GDP? No, it's penguins. You don't care. What you care about is the humanity that's on the piece of land. So if you move the humanity to a place with better institutions, then the flourishing takes place. That's real economic growth too. So instead of being an anti-sweatshop activist, become a pro-immigration activist for these people. So basic punchline here. There's a reason that workers choose them to work in sweatshop. It's because they're better than the available alternatives. The wages are low because productivity low and alternatives are limited. Best cure for this is the process of development. And I should say one reason that productivity is low is not just their physical skills and physical capital, it's bad government policies in these countries. Policies that, you know, your business is at risk of being nationalized, your profits inflated away, your regulations stifling what your profits that you can make, or just corruption. All of these things limit worker productivity in the sense of how much revenue a firm can expect to make from a given worker's physical product. So improving governance there does a lot to instantly raise the upper bound of worker compensation. Unfortunately, I think most of the work that anti-sweatshop groups do risks undermining the very process that will lift living standards over time. So it not only makes them worse off in the short run, it stagnates them in a worse stage of economic development. Institutional reform in the third world is really what's needed to make these workers better off, but that's hard to do. My friend sitting right here, Chris Coyne, has done a lot of work showing how it's hard to export constitutions abroad. You can't do it at gunpoint. Institutions need local support. They don't just stick if you blow people up and then give them a constitution. There's some evidence, actually, that my other friend Peter Leeson's done here on contagious capitalism. So as you trade with people, if your country's more free and you trade with less free people, over time the less free one starts becoming more free. So it's something on the margin that maybe can improve their institutions a little bit. Ultimately, it's about the export of ideas, though, and getting people in these other countries to buy into the fact that you need private property rights, economic freedom, and the rule of law. Until the people there do that and force that on their governments, they're not going to get a high level of economic development. I don't think there's any set recipe of how to best do that, but there's a few things on the margin that we might do, and at a minimum, we should stop doing harm, which is opposing products coming out of sweatshops. Instead, as long as they exist there, I love sweatshop labor, and if you care about the workers, you should too. So, with that, thank you. And,
is that our products are cheaper for Americans than they would otherwise be. I mean, that's not a benefit that we should act like it's something bad. It's good.
Yeah, so I agree, of course, that by having sweatshop workers make products, it makes our products cheaper and us better off. I didn't really bring it up because I think most people agree that we do better off by trading with the sweatshop workers. So they think we're exploiting them and making them worse off by doing it. In fact, what I want to do someday, if any enterprising student here, maybe the Econ Society could get these T-shirts made up. I want T-shirts made up that show like someone working at a sewing machine and have a sweatshop sign on it or something, and have it say, "She fed and clothed her family," and on the back say, "All I got was this lousy T-shirt." Because in some sense, because like people like trivialize the benefits that they're getting things that really, they say it like, oh, we're getting so much out of them, they get nothing out of us. In terms of actually life-changing, my T-shirt's a little bit cheaper. Who cares? I mean, it is an improvement. It's something. I like it. But like their lives transform over this stuff. So I think it's a valid point. I agree with it, just not the one I emphasize usually. Yes? I really do want that T-shirt, by the way.
You talked about the upper bounds. The upper bounds, though, you also discussed how they're going to sweatshop owners are going to prefer to pay a lower amount, and that would require competition between firms to ensure that sweatshop workers are actually getting their upper bound. How much of these sweatshops are actually operating in a free market, and how many of them have some kind of state-protected monopoly?
I wouldn't call it a state-protected monopoly. So one, we've got the average thing that when we look at wages across countries, we get most of the variation being explained by productivity differences. So that's part of the answer. If upper bound's really the action. Where it's not, I think we absolutely should oppose monopolistic agreements between governments who might give monopsony power to a firm to hire local laborers and not let somebody else come in and compete with it. I'm not sure that the best strategy would be to boycott the products from that firm, because workers choosing to work there versus not at all is still an improvement. But we should oppose the government regulation that prevents more competition from coming in. I think in the case of how most garments are produced, though, you see these places clustering in export zones where there's a lot of factories near each other. I don't think the majority of the problem is with monopsony power. It's mostly just productivity problems. There are individual isolated cases, and I think we should work to oppose the government regulations there. The more general question about government cronyism is these are corrupt, poor countries who have bad laws, and all firms probably to some extent have to deal with that system in order to get in there and operate. So everybody's probably a little bit dirty. Other questions? Yes.
Another benefit or detriment that I was thinking about from these sweatshops, if they got rid of the sweatshop factories in a particular area, well, then you would expect that all these workers would be released to go on the market to find work, and they would then drive down the compensation paid to other workers. It's just another implication.
Yeah, sure. The agricultural workers in these countries will be paid less when there's more competition from the people who used to work in sweatshops, and for that matter, less demand for the goods and services being produced by the other ones because their coworkers are now poor. Which, by the way, and this wasn't your question, but people will bring this up related. They'll talk about it's a race to the bottom, though. So they were in Taiwan and Japan, then they left because they had to pay workers too much, and they ran to Vietnam where they could get them for cheaper, and they imply this is a bad thing. It's like, wait a second, when they left, did Taiwan get poor? Or when they left the United States, did my region of New England get poor? No, we got too productive and too wealthy, so they went somewhere poorer and brought up their standard of living. So this race to the bottom is a race continually getting people a lifeline out of poverty, and then as you get too far out of the poverty, you don't need the sweatshop anymore, you do something else. And what it doesn't imply, though, and that people will take from it, again, not you, but just related to this, is that, oh, well, then who's the last to develop? They're going to be stuck with sweatshops forever. Poor Africa is going to get them, and then there's nowhere for them to go because the penguins in Antarctica won't actually work in the sweatshop, so it's stuck in Africa. But just because they're last doesn't mean they have to produce apparel at this standard of living, right? As they become more productive and there's no poorer place for it to go, in order to bid them away from their opportunity cost of doing other things, production in those factories will have to pay them more. So it might look a lot more like production in the United States garment factories do now. So it's possible for everybody to grow out of this. There's no reason someone's going to be impoverished and last in this ladder. Yes, another question.
Mine's more of a comment. I may be mistaken, but I think Tom's followed that strategy, that marketing strategy.
Who?
Tom's. I think they followed the strategy by about the sweatshop stuff, the one picture you showed.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's similar to what you were proposing.
Yeah, I don't know enough about their particular case, but it could be. Various companies have played around with this. The guys at UMass Amherst like to do a lot of surveying consumers if they would be willing to pay more for products that were more ethically produced. And they get people to say yeses to the surveys. I don't really treat that as too serious or evidence sometimes, which is also odd for someone who did a survey himself in this research project. But other than that, I think it could be valuable that they're doing this, and they should just make their survey results available to companies and then let companies see if there's actually any there. Thus far, I don't think there's been good evidence of widespread. I mean, the most widespread successful one is Fairtrade Coffee, which is an entirely different ballgame. And by success, I just mean lots of companies say stuff is fair trade and people buy it and pay more for it, and often the workers are actually worse off as a result, which is part of the feel good versus doing good. You want to follow up?
It could be like the Unite thing that you said.
Yeah. Yep.
I just wanted to get on what you said. There's a Canadian firm called Au Liberté that they make all their shoes in Kenya, and they're like, these are great shoes. They're made like high quality, and we pay all these over the wages, and their shoes are like $150. And what they don't tell you is somebody was actually doing some accounting work on them and found that they're like incredibly unprofitable. This firm, like people are not buying these shoes, and they have to actually rely on a lot of grants just to keep operating.
Yeah. So at best, it's a niche market strategy, and I'm not sure if there's much of a market there. But it's something at least. If the activists want to play around with something, play around with that. Yes?
Just a comment on the charts. They were very informative. Another line that could be put is the high unemployment on these nations. I know some of them have, 40 to 50% unemployment. So these maquilas, they do give employment to people.
Yeah. So often part of the destitute, scavenging, begging alternative is just being unemployed or working in the informal sector. I mean, in a sense, like unemployment statistics are like kind of sketchy in third world countries because when people are unemployed, they don't sit at home just looking for a job. They're employed doing something, but it's more like subsistence, hand-to-mouth type living. But yeah, that's another bad alternative. This one over here.
Your statistics used averages, and I'm assuming, and I know for a fact that many of these countries have high inequality, which would skew the average upwards. So these people are actually, I'm assuming, better off, really, than more than half the people. But I also question regionally. I think I would assume that there'd be a lot of differences within regions and such. So I'm wondering how much mobility these laborers have within the regions and what effect that has on averages and working conditions and such.
Yeah. So absolutely right. That's one of the reasons why I also do like compare it to the $1 and $2 a day threshold, because like lots of people are really poor there. How do these wages compare to that? So I think that's why we do both. But the general thing about inequality within the country, and particularly regions, I didn't say this when I was going over the graph, very relevant for China. So China has massive inequality by geographic region. Those that they have a marketization index of like how market oriented various regions of China became. Those that became more market-oriented have much higher incomes than the other areas. The other areas tend to be more rural and interior. The more market-oriented ones tend to be more in the coastal zones. What you see for the sweatshop workers there is internal migration. It's lots of people from the rural areas coming to work in the coastal one. They come to work for a particular amount of time. Then they take all their earnings that they saved and they go back to the country and have a much higher standard of living than the other people they live around there. It's actually not unlike what we saw happening in the United States in the 19th century, where there was a lot of farm women who would leave the farm, come work in Lowell for a while, and then go back to the farm with all of their savings. So like China, it grossly understates how much better off it makes the workers who are working there compared to like their regional low income. So definitely an aspect of that. Yes?
I was kind of wondering, you've given this speech or discussion several times. What's been the trend that you've detected as far as a bit of acceptance or more denial? Because I mean, this is a very demonized topic, and it just takes a lot of courage to get out there to offer a radically logical, different approach to looking at this kind of thing.
Yeah, so I don't know if there's been a trend. There's a high variance. Chris has actually witnessed one of the more colorful reactions to it one time, but there have been others. Oftentimes, so if I get a mostly economics crowd, they're like nodding their head and like, oh, this is cool evidence for a topic that makes economic sense to us. If I get the women's studies or human trafficking crowd, I get lots of people kind of glaring at me who haven't bathed. And then they, and what they look, so usually they don't get mad though. It's they don't understand economic logic or haven't really encountered it, and they like, I don't know what's wrong about your talk, but something's wrong. And it's like, you mean it makes you not feel good or feel dirty? Yes. I'm like, well, it makes people better off if you feel not good and dirty. One time I was called a racist, which was baffling to me. They said, I have no idea, you have no idea how racist you sound. I said, racist? I said, wait, it was good for white people. It was good for yellow people. It was good for brown people now. And I said it would be good for blacker people in Africa. I'm like, where's the racism in this? Turns out economic development is white. See, the rest of the world was well off before, and then when you bring them factories, it makes people poor because they had an idyllic life in the forest before that. And by bringing them our standard of type of production, it's imposing our views on them, which makes them kind of bizarre. Invited her to take a walk out into the mountains and see the bounty that nature provides.
After all your sweatshop questions, maybe a few words about Freedom Watch or the demise of it. You got anything juicy to offer here?
I have nothing juicy to offer other than sadness that I was a regular commentator on a TV show, Freedom Watch, that Judge Napolitano did, and I had a blast doing it. It was always fun to do quick little segments with him, and I found it completely bizarre from a period of, 12 years ago when we were in graduate school together, at like who were into libertarianism and free markets, that like 12 years later there could be a TV show on TV that does that type of stuff. I thought it was great. So I'm sad to see it go, and wish him the best for future stuff. Thanks, it was. One more?
You gave a chart about the average costs or the average income of these countries. It would be nice to see a detailed price evaluation on how much 31 cents will get them in one country versus 60 cents in another country. Because 60 cents in our country won't even get us a candy bar, whereas 60 cents in Honduras will get them all sorts of stuff. And I'm in total support of the sweatshops idea. I just would like to see, I think it would prove a lot more to show how much these small wages actually do get them, and that 61 cents isn't exactly a small wage in comparison to what they can get for it.
Yeah, so that's actually what we do here. So this is when we got the percentage of the population that's living on less than $1 or $2 per day. That's adjusting for purchasing power differences across countries. So then we can use the same purchasing power parity conversion. So that's actually making $1 buy the same bundle of goods across all these different countries in this slide there. So the punchline still kind of remains the same, just even more dramatic. But yeah, there's big differences, of course, between countries. All right, I guess one final question, or are we all, is the mic gone? You still have the mic? I don't have the mic. We don't have the mic. All right, well, thank you all very much, and I'll chat with you afterwards.